In the raw, unforgiving streets of early 20th century New York, a boy from a poor immigrant family would rise to reshape the criminal underworld. Lucky Luciano, once an outsider, redefined the mafia with a vision that transformed it from fractured gangs into a unified empire. But with power came betrayal, and the very men who helped him rise would ultimately seek his downfall. This is the story of ambition, loyalty, and the dangerous price of success. The story of Lucky Luciano's rise and fall, where betrayal lurked in the shadows and loyalty was the deadliest weapon. The story of Lucky Luciano is one that looms large in the annals of American crime, a tale woven with ambition, ruthlessness, betrayal, and ultimate tragedy. But before we can delve into the finer details of his criminal genius, it's essential to understand just how complex and powerful a figure he was in shaping not just the criminal underworld of New York but the entire landscape of organized crime in America. At his peak, Luciano was not only a feared don but a mastermind who orchestrated some of the most groundbreaking changes in how the mafia operated. He created a criminal empire that, for decades, would be the envy of both underworld figures and law enforcement alike. To understand Luciano's legacy, we must first acknowledge the system he was a part of, a system that existed in the shadows but was deeply embedded in the fabric of American society during the early to mid-20th century. The mafia, particularly in New York, was not just a gang of criminals but a thriving shadow government that controlled vast amounts of the city's economic and political life. The men who ran it were not simply thugs. They were entrepreneurs, politicians, and in many ways visionaries who understood the value of power, loyalty, and fear. But what set Lucky Luciano apart from the others was his ability to see the bigger picture, to recognize that the future of organized crime required something more than the brute force that had characterized it for so long. Luciano's story begins not with a silver spoon in his mouth, but rather in the gritty streets of New York's Lower East Side. Born in 1897 to Sicilian immigrants, Luciano's early life was far from glamorous. His family, like many others in the early 20th century, faced the crushing weight of poverty and the harsh realities of immigrant life in America. Yet, from a young age, Luciano displayed a ruthlessness that would later define him. Raised in a neighborhood where survival depended on strength and cunning, Luciano became deeply acquainted with the criminal world, learning early on that power was everything. By his teenage years, Luciano was already making a name for himself in the streets, running small-time scams, and working his way up through the ranks of local gangs. He quickly caught the attention of the older, more experienced figures in New York's criminal syndicates. It wasn't long before he found himself in the orbit of some of the most powerful crime families in the city, particularly those aligned with the powerful but increasingly outdated structure of the five families, who were locked in a deadly turf war. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were content with operating within their narrow territories, Luciano had bigger ambitions. He was a man who saw the whole city, and eventually the entire country, as his playground. His early criminal activities were, to some extent, a stepping stone. He wasn't just about petty crime. Luciano wanted to reshape the way the mafia operated. But it wasn't just about ambition, it was about survival. During the Prohibition era, the mafia had transformed from a collection of street gangs into a thriving business, capitalizing on the booming illegal alcohol trade. But for all their success, the system remained fractured. The five families, particularly the Masuria and Maranzano factions, were constantly at odds with one another, embroiled in vicious power struggles that made them vulnerable to both rival gangs and law enforcement. It was in this fractured world that Luciano would begin to plant the seeds of his future empire. Luciano understood that to truly gain power, he needed more than just street muscle. He needed organization. And so, he set about not only consolidating power but also restructuring the entire underworld. Rather than clinging to old feudal-like traditions of criminal enterprise, he would create something more businesslike, a hierarchical system that would be better equipped to handle the growing complexity of crime in the modern world. He introduced a level of professionalism that had never been seen before in the mafia, breaking from tradition and introducing new methods of operation. He envisioned the mafia not just as a group of petty criminals but as a global enterprise with carefully defined roles and responsibilities. He achieved this vision through what became known as the Commission, a governing body made up of representatives from the major families in New York and beyond. This commission wasn't just about making decisions, it was about ensuring peace, order, and stability within the ranks. In the old days, mafia conflicts were settled through bloodshed. Luciano, however, saw that constant infighting weakened the organization, leaving it vulnerable to law enforcement and rival gangs. By creating the commission, he ensured that disputes were settled diplomatically, reducing the risk of chaos. This was not just smart, This was revolutionary. Luciano was a brilliant tactician. He knew how to maneuver within the web of both criminal and legitimate businesses. He had learned from some of the best in the trade, including the ruthless mobster Frank Costello, who would later become one of his closest allies. Luciano's ability to make connections was extraordinary. He had the rare gift of seeing value in alliances where others saw threats. But even more impressive was his ability to maintain control, even when it seemed like he might be losing it. The truth was, Luciano had enemies. Enemies within his own ranks, rivals who felt threatened by his rise, and enemies in the law enforcement community who were eager to bring him down. For all his charisma and intelligence, Luciano's world was fraught with danger at every turn. And it was this danger, this constant threat of betrayal and exposure, that would shape much of Luciano's life. Unlike many other criminals who relied on sheer violence to maintain control, Luciano had learned that in the world of organized crime, the real power lay in manipulation, in control, and in subtlety. But as Luciano's power grew, so did the opposition. The very men who had once helped him rise to the top would soon become the very same ones who would turn on him. The world of organized crime is often portrayed as a brotherhood, a place where loyalty reigns supreme. But in reality, it is a world built on fear, and fear breeds betrayal. Luciano, for all his genius, would soon find himself at the mercy of those who had once been his closest allies. This is the heart of his story, his rise to unimaginable power and his inevitable fall. As we journey through the life of Lucky Luciano, we will explore not only his criminal exploits but also the psychological toll of his decisions. We will examine the moral compromises he made, the cost of his ambition, and the relationships he sacrificed along the way. Luciano's story is one of extraordinary contrasts, from the dazzling heights of power to the depths of betrayal and imprisonment. It is a story of a man who shaped the very world he inhabited but ultimately paid the price for his vision. In the end, Luciano's life serves as a timeless cautionary tale. A man who, despite his brilliance and audacity, could not escape the inevitable consequences of a life spent in the pursuit of power. His story is one that raises critical questions about the nature of ambition, loyalty, and the true cost of success. Was Luciano a visionary, or simply a product of a corrupt system that ultimately consumed him? The answer, as with so many things in life, is not so easily defined. But one thing is clear. Luciano's mark on history is indelible, and his life, filled with triumphs and tragedies, will continue to fascinate and intrigue for generations to come. Before Lucky Luciano came to power, the world of organized crime in America was a chaotic and fragmented place. Crime in the early 20th century was a raw and untamed force, driven by numerous factions that fought tooth and nail for control of various illegal enterprises. The mafia, as we recognize it today, did not exist in the same way. Instead, it was a collection of warring families and independent criminals, each with its own turf, its own code, and its own methods. But there was something deeply flawed in this fractured system. Power was constantly shifting, alliances were as fragile as glass, and law enforcement was growing ever more determined to put an end to the lawlessness that threatened to consume the nation. The underworld was not unified, nor was it particularly efficient. It was a place where personal vendettas often outlasted business interests, and where the lack of cooperation left vast openings for law enforcement to exploit. At the heart of this disorganization were the five families of New York, powerful crime syndicates that controlled everything from illegal gambling and bootlegging to labor racketeering and prostitution. Yet, despite their size and influence, these families were far from unified. In fact, they were often locked in deadly conflicts that not only destroyed lives but also endangered their businesses. Rivalries between the families, particularly the conflicts between the two largest factions, the Masuria and Maranzano factions, had caused immense bloodshed. The war between these factions was a brutal and ongoing affair, one that was as much about power as it was about respect, tradition, and the desire for control over the lucrative criminal operations in New York. In the middle of this turmoil, the mafia was at a crossroads. The old ways of doing business were increasingly becoming obsolete. The code of honor, loyalty, and violent retribution that had worked for decades was no longer as effective in a rapidly changing world. The business of crime was growing in complexity, and it required new ways of thinking and operating, strategic minds that could not only survive in a hostile environment but thrive in it. This was the world Luciano entered, a world of blood feuds, mistrust, and a lack of cohesion that would eventually shape his approach to power. Born in 1897 to Sicilian immigrants, Charles Lucky Luciano came from humble beginnings, raised in the immigrant-heavy Lower East Side of New York. Like so many others, his early life was marked by hardship. His family, struggling to make ends meet, was part of a larger wave of Italian immigrants who faced severe prejudice and discrimination in their new homeland. As a child, Luciano was exposed to the harsh realities of life on the streets. The culture of violence, crime, and survival was deeply ingrained in his environment, and it didn't take long for him to start making connections that would later serve him in his rise to power. From a young age, Luciano showed a natural talent for recognizing opportunity and exploiting it. He wasn't drawn to street-level crime for the sake of it. Instead, he viewed it as a stepping stone, a means to something greater. While others around him were content to scrape by with petty scams or small-time hustles, Luciano had bigger dreams. He saw crime as a business and understood that it had the potential to be far more lucrative and far-reaching than most of his contemporaries realized. Unlike the traditionalists who clung to the old-school ways of operating, Luciano saw the potential for a more organized, efficient system. One where power was consolidated, alliances were forged, and profit was maximized. But Luciano's ambitions were not born in isolation. He was not the only one who recognized the need for a new approach. The mafia, for all its history, had been built on a foundation of violence and secrecy. The structure of the families was deeply entrenched in traditional codes of honor and retribution, and this system was increasingly at odds with the growing opportunities in the world of crime. Bootlegging, smuggling, and illegal gambling were expanding, and they required a level of organization and strategic planning that the old feudal system could not provide. Criminal empires, particularly in New York, needed to evolve, or they risked being overtaken by outside forces, rival gangs, or even the police. The threat of law enforcement was always looming, but it wasn't just the government that posed a danger. The fragmentation of the mafia itself was a serious liability. The constant infighting between factions weakened the families, making them vulnerable not only to law enforcement but to the rise of external enemies, both criminal and political. The tension between the Masuria and Maranzano families in particular set the stage for a shift in power. Both were powerful men who wanted to control New York's vast criminal empire, but they were locked in a destructive battle for dominance. Their conflict bled into every aspect of mafia life, from gambling and extortion to union racketeering and drug trafficking. The bloodshed was rampant, and the instability created the perfect environment for an ambitious and calculated figure like Luciano to make his move. Luciano's genius lay not in his brute force, but in his ability to navigate the delicate world of alliances and betrayal. He understood that true power wasn't just about having the biggest muscle, it was about having the right people in the right positions. He began to weave a network of alliances that transcended the traditional boundaries of the mafia. He reached out to men who shared his vision of a more organized and less chaotic criminal world. He aligned himself with Frank Costello, one of the most influential figures in the underworld at the time, and others who saw the potential for a restructured mafia that would be more efficient, less violent, and better positioned to maximize profits. But this new way of thinking didn't come without its challenges. Luciano's rise was met with skepticism and outright hostility from some of the old guard. To them, Luciano's vision of a united mafia was a threat to the very essence of their power. The concept of unity was foreign to many of them. They were used to the old ways, where each family operated independently, answering only to their own bosses and relying on blood feuds and retribution to settle disputes. The idea of cooperation, of negotiating through a commission rather than through violence, was unsettling to many in the mafia. Yet Luciano, with his remarkable ability to foresee the future of crime, knew that this was the only way forward. By the time Luciano had reached the height of his power, the mafia in New York was no longer a loose collection of gangs. It was an empire, built on the foundations of Luciano's vision. He had managed to broker peace between the warring factions, creating the commission that would serve as the governing body for the mafia, reducing the constant infighting that had plagued the families for years. The commission provided a platform for decision-making and conflict resolution that allowed the families to operate in a more unified, less destructive manner. It also allowed Luciano to maintain control while keeping the peace, making him the undisputed boss of New York's underworld. This new structure was revolutionary in many ways. The old feudal system, based on personal loyalties and the power of individual families, was replaced by a more corporate-style organization, where business was prioritized over bloodshed. Luciano had created a system where cooperation and coordination between families were the keys to survival. He had transformed the mafia from a chaotic, violent entity into a well-oiled criminal machine that was capable of taking on any rival, outsmarting any law enforcement agency, and making vast amounts of money in the process. Luciano's world was one where power was not only measured in terms of territory and muscle but also in terms of influence and strategy. He understood that loyalty, while important, was only one part of the equation. The other part was control, the ability to manipulate situations, people, and events to his advantage. It was this combination of loyalty, control, and strategy that made Luciano a force to be reckoned with, a man who not only survived the chaotic underworld but transformed it into something far more powerful and far-reaching than anyone had ever imagined. Lucky Luciano's early life was a far cry from the glamorous, high-stakes world of the mafia that he would eventually come to dominate. Born in 1897 in the crowded, immigrant-heavy streets of New York City's Lower East Side, Luciano's formative years were marked by poverty, struggle, and a harsh, unforgiving environment. His parents, Sicilian immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life, found themselves trapped in the same cycle of hardship that defined so many working-class families of the time. Luciano's early childhood was shaped by the reality of this immigrant experience, living in cramped tenements, working long hours just to scrape by, and constantly facing the racial and cultural prejudices of a society that was unwilling to fully accept them. From the beginning, Luciano's life was one of contrasts. On the one hand, he was raised within the confines of his immigrant family's traditional values, loyalty, family, and hard work. But on the other hand, the world around him was anything but conventional. The Lower East Side was a hotbed of criminal activity, a place where young boys like Luciano were often forced to grow up fast. For many, the street was their classroom and the lessons taught were brutal and unforgiving. In this environment, survival often meant adopting a mindset where power, fear, and respect ruled. Luciano was no exception. As a teenager, he began to develop the qualities that would later define him as a criminal mastermind. He was smart, streetwise, and possessed a natural ability to read people. Unlike many of the other kids in the neighborhood who resorted to petty theft and street fights, Luciano quickly realized that there were greater opportunities to be had. Rather than being consumed by the violence that surrounded him, he began to see it as a means to an end. He knew that the path to power in this world was not just about fighting for survival, it was about understanding the rules of the game and using them to his advantage. He began working with local gangs, participating in small-time hustles and learning the tricks of the trade. But Luciano wasn't content with staying in the lower ranks. He had a vision for himself that stretched far beyond the confines of his impoverished upbringing. One of the defining moments in his early life came when he was recruited by a group of Italian-American gangsters. This was not a random occurrence. Luciano had made a name for himself by proving that he was smart and capable of thinking beyond the immediate. It was through these early affiliations that he began to come into contact with the men who would shape his future. His association with these gangsters would set him on a path that would eventually lead to his rise as one of the most powerful men in New York's criminal world. But it wasn't just about making money or gaining influence. Luciano was a man driven by a vision of something bigger, something far-reaching. He was also deeply influenced by the environment of corruption that flourished in the early 20th century. The police force in New York City at the time was rife with corruption, as was much of the local political structure. This created a world where crime and law enforcement were often two sides of the same coin. For someone like Luciano, who had already seen the way power operated on the streets, this was a world full of opportunity. He quickly learned that the key to navigating the underworld was not just muscle or intelligence, but the ability to build relationships, create alliances, and perhaps most importantly, maintain an air of discretion. Luciano's rise within the criminal world was rapid. He wasn't one to make a spectacle of himself or engage in senseless violence. Instead, he understood the importance of patience and strategic thinking. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already begun to move up the ranks of the mafia. He became involved in various illegal enterprises, most notably the bootlegging industry, which was thriving during Prohibition. The demand for illegal alcohol was at an all-time high, and Luciano was quick to capitalize on this lucrative market. But Luciano was not content with simply participating in these operations. He had a vision of transforming them into a more organized and streamlined business. The criminal enterprises that dominated New York's underworld were often chaotic and disjointed. Each faction operated independently, frequently clashing with others over territory and profits. Luciano recognized that this lack of unity created significant vulnerabilities in the system. There was a profound inefficiency in how crime was conducted, and this inefficiency left the mafia vulnerable to rival groups and law enforcement. Luciano's ability to recognize these flaws and understand how to fix them would set him apart from his contemporaries. Unlike the old guard, who were content with violence and brute force, Luciano sought a more businesslike approach to crime. He envisioned a world where the mafia was not just a series of independent, warring factions, but a well-organized, coordinated system that could operate with precision and efficiency. This vision began to take shape when Luciano began working closely with others who shared his outlook. One of his most important early alliances was with Frank Costello, a fellow mobster who would become one of his closest and most trusted allies. The two men quickly formed a bond, recognizing that they could achieve far more by working together than by competing with each other. Costello, known for his intelligence and ability to navigate the political world, was an invaluable asset to Luciano. Together they began to build a network of allies within the underworld, each with specific expertise and knowledge that complemented their own. But Luciano's vision was not limited to New York City. He understood that the future of organized crime would not be confined to a single city or even a single country. He was keenly aware of the growing opportunities in illegal trade on a global scale. With his vast network of contacts, Luciano began to expand his operations beyond the borders of New York. He established connections with international criminals, ensuring that his empire had a far-reaching influence. At the same time, he maintained a careful balance of power within the city itself, using his connections to control a variety of illegal enterprises and keeping rival factions in check. One of the key lessons that Luciano learned early on was the importance of controlling the flow of information. The mafia, like any other organization, relied on secrecy to maintain power. Luciano understood that the more information he had, the better equipped he would be to make decisions and protect his empire. He cultivated a network of informants and allies who provided him with valuable intelligence on rival factions, law enforcement, and political developments. This ability to control information and stay one step ahead of his enemies would become one of the hallmarks of his leadership. Luciano's early years in the mafia were defined by his strategic thinking, his ability to form powerful alliances, and his unwavering ambition. He was not driven by the desire for wealth alone but by a deeper, more complex vision of what the mafia could be. In his mind, crime was not just a way of life, it was a business, and business required order, discipline, and strategy. He was a man who understood the nuances of power, loyalty, and fear, and he used these qualities to rise through the ranks. But his journey was not without its struggles. He faced constant threats from rival factions, the ever-present danger of betrayal, and the looming possibility of law enforcement. Despite the challenges, Luciano's reputation grew rapidly. His intelligence and cunning made him a force to be reckoned with. He was soon recognized as one of the most promising and ambitious figures in the mafia. But even as his power grew, Luciano never lost sight of his original goal: to create a unified, efficient, and powerful criminal empire. He knew that to achieve this he would need to continue expanding his network of allies, make strategic decisions that minimized risks, and above all, maintain a level of control over every aspect of his operations. Luciano's early years in the mafia were marked by a combination of careful planning, strategic alliances, and an understanding of the realities of power. He didn't simply react to the world around him, he shaped it. And in doing so, he set the stage for a new era of organized crime, one in which the mafia would no longer be a collection of warring factions, but a global empire, built on the principles of order, efficiency, and ruthlessness. The ascent of Lucky Luciano to the pinnacle of power within the American mafia was not the result of mere happenstance. It was a culmination of strategy, intellect, and an ability to see opportunities where others saw only chaos. Luciano's rise was defined by his ability to organize, to restructure, and most significantly, to transform the mafia into a far more sophisticated, business-minded enterprise. In many ways, Luciano didn't just climb the criminal ladder. He redefined the very structure of organized crime in America, creating an empire that would endure for decades to come. The mafia in the early 20th century was not a uniform organization. It was a loose collection of families, each with their own turf, their own leaders, and their own methods. The competition between these factions was fierce, often violent, and frequently resulted in bloody turf wars. This fragmented structure was rife with inefficiencies. Leaders often waged wars over territory, and disputes were resolved not through negotiation but through bloodshed. The old ways, steeped in tradition and honor, were no longer sustainable. While there was plenty of money to be made in illegal activities such as bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, the chaotic nature of the mafia made it vulnerable. Rivalries were constant, and the lack of a centralized structure allowed external forces, rival gangs, law enforcement, and even corrupt politicians, to weaken the mafia's dominance. Luciano saw the inherent flaws in this system and recognized that if the mafia was to survive and thrive, it needed to be reorganized, streamlined, and made more efficient. It was not just about the violence or the money, it was about creating a system that could endure beyond the whims of any one gangster or family. His ambition was to create something far more enduring, something that could operate as smoothly and systematically as any legitimate corporation. The first step in Luciano's plan was to consolidate power. In the mafia, power was typically decentralized. The heads of the various families ruled their territories with impunity, and there was little cooperation between families. Luciano knew that to become the ultimate power in the underworld, he needed to unite these factions under one cohesive structure. The most famous and significant of these moves came when he brokered the formation of the Commission, a governing body that would represent the collective interests of the most powerful mafia families. The Commission wasn't just an idea, it was a revolutionary concept that would change the way the mafia operated. It was a move towards institutionalizing mafia power, creating a form of governance that would resolve disputes and ensure that the families could coexist peacefully, without the constant threat of bloodshed and chaos. But Luciano didn't stop there. He understood that power in the mafia was not just about brute force, it was about control, influence, and perhaps most importantly, money. While many of the older mafia bosses clung to traditional, inefficient methods of generating income, Luciano saw the potential for organized crime to operate as a far more sophisticated and profitable business. He introduced a new approach to the mafia's operations, transforming them from loosely connected street-level operations into well-organized, large-scale enterprises. Luciano's innovation lay in his ability to recognize the value of economies of scale. He was not simply concerned with making money through illicit activities. He sought to systematize these activities, creating efficient networks that could generate enormous profits. One of the cornerstones of Luciano's success was his embrace of prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol that began in 1920 created a massive black market for illegal booze, and Luciano recognized this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. However, unlike many of his rivals who were satisfied with smuggling alcohol on a small scale, Luciano saw the potential for large-scale, organized operations. He used his connections to create a massive network for the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol. His operation was sophisticated, and his connections extended far beyond the streets of New York City. Luciano established ties with other criminal organizations, both within the United States and abroad, to ensure that his bootlegging operations ran smoothly and efficiently. At the heart of Luciano's success was his ability to think strategically. He didn't just rely on muscle or traditional mafia tactics to maintain his power. He used his intellect to outmaneuver his rivals. He understood that in the world of organized crime, it was just as important to know who your allies were as it was to know who your enemies were. Luciano forged alliances with other mafia figures, building a network of loyal associates who helped him secure his position at the top. He was not afraid to work with others who might have once been considered rivals, and this flexibility allowed him to extend his reach far beyond the streets of New York. One of the key components of Luciano's strategy was his ability to manage and oversee various criminal enterprises simultaneously. While his main focus was on bootlegging, he also recognized the value in diversifying his operations. Luciano extended his reach into areas such as gambling, labor racketeering, and prostitution. Each of these enterprises was run with military precision, ensuring that they generated steady profits while maintaining low levels of visibility. Luciano's empire wasn't just a series of isolated, independent criminal acts. It was a vast, interconnected network of operations that worked together seamlessly. This diversification allowed Luciano to weather the storms that often came with the violent nature of the mafia. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano did not rely solely on violence to solve problems. While he certainly had the muscle to back up his operations, he understood that violence could be counterproductive. It drew unwanted attention from law enforcement and made it harder to build lasting alliances. Instead, Luciano used his ability to maintain control through strategic thinking, intelligence, and subtlety. He understood that fear was a tool, but loyalty and respect were the true keys to power. As such, he carefully crafted relationships with both criminal figures and politicians, building a web of influence that allowed him to maintain his grip on power without resorting to unnecessary bloodshed. Another of Luciano's key innovations was his ability to manage the logistics of his operations. While other mobsters focused on street-level crime, Luciano realized that if he wanted to dominate the criminal world, he needed to control the flow of goods and money. He developed an intricate network of transporters, smugglers, and distributors who could move illegal goods across vast distances. This ability to manage logistics on a large scale was something that set Luciano apart from many of his rivals. While others may have been focused on local criminal activity, Luciano was building a global empire that spanned across the United States and beyond. But Luciano's genius was not just in his ability to organize crime, it was in his ability to create a system that could function without him at the helm. He realized early on that, for his empire to survive in the long term, it couldn't be dependent on any one person. As such, he implemented a system where power was more decentralized, with various members of his organization taking on specific roles and responsibilities. He created a structure where each family had autonomy but also had to answer to the commission, ensuring that the interests of all the families were aligned. This level of organization made Luciano's mafia not only more profitable but also more durable. While many mafia organizations were ultimately undone by internal strife, betrayal, or law enforcement, Luciano's empire was built to endure. His methods of operation, his strategic alliances, and his ability to think several steps ahead ensured that his organization could withstand the inevitable challenges that would arise. Luciano's power was not simply a matter of brute force or intimidation. His success was a direct result of his ability to create a new order within the chaotic world of organized crime. He understood that the future of the mafia depended on efficiency, structure, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. As prohibition ended and the world of organized crime began to evolve, Luciano's methods allowed him to maintain control of the mafia even as the landscape around him shifted. In the end, Lucky Luciano's rise to power was a testament to his intelligence, his strategic thinking, and his ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk. He didn't just want to be the king of New York's underworld, he wanted to be the architect of a new order, a criminal empire that would be the envy of the world. And in that, he succeeded, leaving behind a legacy that would shape the course of organized crime for generations to come. The mafia, in its most traditional sense, was not merely a criminal syndicate. It was a society with its own intricate code, its own sense of honor, and its own set of rules that governed everything from loyalty and betrayal to life and death. At the heart of this code was the concept of omerta, the code of silence and respect, a foundational principle that defined the mafia's very existence. To understand the psychological and moral complexities of men like Lucky Luciano, one must first grasp the power of this code. It was not just a set of rules, it was the lens through which every decision was made, the glue that held the mafia together, and the invisible force that dictated how power was wielded and relationships were forged. Omerta was more than just an unwritten rule, it was an unbreakable law within the mafia. It demanded absolute loyalty, silence in the face of law enforcement, and complete disregard for the outside world's rules. The essence of omerta was that members of the mafia were not supposed to betray one another, even under the threat of death. Informing on fellow mobsters to the police was considered the ultimate sin, one that carried immediate and severe consequences. In a world where life was cheap and the rule of law was often an afterthought, omerta provided a sense of order and stability within the chaotic world of organized crime. It gave structure to an otherwise lawless system, ensuring that the bonds between members were strong and unbreakable. For Luciano, omerta was not just a moral guideline, it was the key to maintaining control over his growing empire. In the cutthroat world of the mafia, where betrayal was rampant and allegiances shifted like sand, omerta allowed Luciano to create a system based on trust, or at least the fear of its violation. Loyalty was paramount, and any breach of that loyalty, whether through betrayal or weakness, was unforgivable. The mafia's code was a tool for controlling behavior, but it also served as a powerful psychological weapon. Loyalty, once established, became an unshakable bond that bound Luciano's underlings to him, ensuring that his power was never threatened from within. The psychological underpinnings of omerta cannot be understated. In many ways, it transformed its adherents into men capable of extraordinary acts of loyalty and violence. The fear of retribution, the shame of breaking the code, and the psychological weight of betraying one's brothers were powerful forces in the minds of mafia members. The concept of honor, as defined by omerta, gave a sense of purpose and identity to the men who followed it. It created a bond stronger than family ties, a bond that could not be easily broken by threats or money. To betray this code was to forfeit one's place within the mafia, sometimes even one's life. However, omerta also had its limitations. It was, at its core, a fragile system, held together by the very fear and violence it sought to control. A betrayal within the ranks could lead to catastrophic consequences, as it would bring the wrath of not just the mafia boss but also the community. The very act of betrayal under the rules of omerta was a declaration of war. This put Luciano in a unique position. He was not just a boss, he was a king who governed with an understanding of the psychological and emotional forces that motivated his men. He knew that in order to hold power he had to nurture loyalty through fear, respect, and the careful cultivation of personal bonds. The mafia wasn't just about making money or expanding territory, it was about maintaining the integrity of the code and making sure that every member understood the consequences of breaking it. The concept of honor as tied to omerta was deeply psychological. It was more than a matter of tradition, it was a way of life for those in the mafia. Men like Luciano knew that loyalty, once earned, could be leveraged to create unshakable alliances and control. They also knew that omerta was not something that could be easily bent or broken without consequence. In a world where loyalty and power were inextricably linked, the mafia's code was the ultimate measure of both. For Luciano, enforcing omerta was a way to secure not only his own power but also the future of the entire mafia structure he was building. Yet, omerta was not just about preserving the status quo. It was also a tool for expansion. Luciano's understanding of omerta allowed him to consolidate power across various factions, and he used the code to forge bonds that span New York and beyond. He understood that in order to build an empire, he needed to build trust, among his own men and with other mafia families. Omerta provided the foundation upon which Luciano built his network of loyalists and allies, ensuring that the code of silence and respect was observed by all. This loyalty was not just abstract or moral, it was deeply practical. Omerta ensured that Luciano could trust his men to operate independently within their own territories without fear of betrayal or interference. His empire depended on a system where each family operated as part of a larger whole, and omerta was the invisible force that held it all together. But Luciano was not blind to the realities of the code. He knew that loyalty could be bought, manipulated, or shattered. Omerta, while a powerful force, was ultimately fragile, and he was fully aware of its limitations. It was, after all, only as strong as the men who followed it. While loyalty was the bedrock of his power, Luciano also understood that loyalty could not be maintained purely by fear and intimidation. Over time, he learned that the key to keeping his empire intact was not simply the threat of violence but the careful cultivation of relationships, respect, and shared interests. By creating a network of men who were not only loyal but also personally invested in the success of his empire, Luciano created a system where the rules of omerta were not just enforced by force but by shared goals. However, loyalty was always a double-edged sword. While omerta ensured that the mafia was bound by a sense of duty and fear, it also created the perfect breeding ground for betrayal. A betrayal within the ranks of the mafia was considered one of the gravest offenses, but it was not always clear-cut. The line between loyalty and betrayal was often blurred, and many mafia members found themselves caught in moral dilemmas that tested their loyalty to the code. In such a volatile environment, even the most trusted men could turn against their leaders if the circumstances were right. This constant tension between loyalty and betrayal was a dynamic that shaped Luciano's decisions and strategies, often pushing him to make difficult and, at times, ruthless choices. Luciano's genius lay in his understanding of this dynamic. He knew that, in the world of organized crime, loyalty could never be taken for granted. He had to constantly reinforce it, keeping his men both fearful and respectful. But he also knew that fear alone was not enough. He had to create an environment where loyalty was incentivized, where it was in a man's best interest to remain loyal. Luciano crafted a system where loyalty was rewarded, and disloyalty was punished not just with violence but with exile, a fate worse than death for many in the mafia. This balance between rewards and punishments ensured that Luciano's empire ran smoothly and that omerta was maintained, even as the stakes continued to rise. Omerta, in the world that Luciano created, was not simply a rule. It was a way of life, a psychological foundation that governed everything. For Luciano, it was both the bedrock and the blueprint for his power. It was a tool that allowed him to forge an empire out of chaos, to turn warring factions into a unified force. But it was also a system that was fraught with danger, one that required constant attention and delicate management. The balance of loyalty and fear was never perfect, and as Luciano's empire grew, so too did the risks that came with it. Omerta kept his men in line, but it also created a world where betrayal was never far behind, and where the consequences of violating the code were always severe. In the end, omerta was the force that allowed Luciano to build a powerful, enduring empire. It was the force that kept his underlings in check and ensured that his operations ran smoothly. But it was also the force that ultimately ensured his downfall. The code of silence, loyalty, and fear that bound Luciano's empire together would eventually tear it apart, as the very men who had sworn loyalty to him were faced with the moral and psychological dilemmas that came with living a life of crime. Despite its power, Omerta was ultimately a fragile construct, one that could be shattered by betrayal, and Luciano's empire was never truly immune from the cracks that lay beneath its surface. In the intricate world of organized crime, power isn't only derived from brute strength or violent retribution. It's also shaped by business acumen and strategic maneuvering. Lucky Luciano, whose rise through the mafia ranks was largely defined by his vision of a more organized and streamlined criminal enterprise, revolutionized the very nature of crime. His transformation of the mafia into a legitimate, sophisticated business organization marked a turning point in the history of American organized crime, paving the way for the mafia to function as a well-oiled machine capable of exerting influence far beyond the street-level turf wars and chaotic rivalries that had previously characterized it. The early days of Luciano's mafia operations were defined by the volatile, unpredictable nature of the underworld. The Prohibition era, which started in 1920 with the nationwide ban on alcohol, opened an enormous opportunity for those who had the means to exploit it. Bootlegging, the illegal production and distribution of alcohol, was one of the most lucrative ventures for organized crime, and it became the focal point of Luciano's criminal enterprises. But Luciano's understanding of how to profit from prohibition went far beyond simply smuggling alcohol. He saw it as an opportunity to create a criminal empire that would operate with the same level of efficiency, hierarchy, and business sense as any legitimate corporation. Luciano understood that to dominate the growing bootlegging market, he had to bring order to the chaos of the competing gangs, turf wars and fragmented criminal operations. In many ways, the mafia was still operating under outdated methods. Each family controlled their individual territories, and the larger goal of cooperation for mutual benefit was often lost in the constant struggle for dominance. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to recognize that criminal enterprises, if managed well, could generate more wealth and power than ever before. He began by forging strategic alliances with key figures in the underworld, uniting various factions under one umbrella to eliminate the fragmentation that had historically plagued the mafia. Where his predecessors relied on brute force to establish control, Luciano preferred a different method. He understood that success in the criminal world wasn't about having the largest arsenal or the most ruthless enforcers, it was about having the best infrastructure. Luciano approached his operations with the mindset of a businessman, understanding the importance of logistics, distribution, and efficiency. Instead of having multiple, competing operations running inefficiently, Luciano created a single, streamlined network that could dominate the bootlegging market. He and his allies worked to establish distribution routes, set up networks of contacts, and create a supply chain that stretched from the rum-running boats of the Caribbean to the bars and speakeasies of New York City. But bootlegging was only the beginning. Luciano recognized that crime, much like any legitimate business, required diversification to thrive. As he built his empire, Luciano extended his reach into other areas of illegal activity, including gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and prostitution. Each of these operations required different management strategies, but Luciano's ability to operate in multiple sectors simultaneously allowed him to create a more resilient and expansive criminal network. His network of connections, both within the criminal underworld and in the world of politics and law enforcement, allowed him to keep his operations running smoothly and out of sight from authorities. One of the ways Luciano extended his influence was by becoming deeply involved in labor racketeering. Unions were a vital part of the American economy, and by infiltrating and taking control of key unions, Luciano and his allies were able to extract profits from industries ranging from construction to dock work. Labor racketeering allowed Luciano to siphon money from legitimate businesses while keeping his operations hidden behind the facade of union representation. With the help of men like Frank Costello, who was known for his political savvy and ability to navigate legal systems, Luciano was able to manipulate labor unions to further expand his reach. Luciano's criminal operations weren't just about illegal activity, they were also about creating systems of influence and control. He understood that in order for his empire to last, he needed to build lasting relationships with key figures, both within and outside of the criminal world. Unlike the violent, short-sighted approaches of some of his predecessors, Luciano emphasized the importance of diplomacy, negotiation, and mutual benefit. His ability to form alliances with other gangsters, business owners, and even politicians helped him maintain control over his operations, providing a level of security that many of his contemporaries lacked. One of the most significant innovations that Luciano introduced to the mafia was the establishment of the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the 5 major mafia families in New York. The Commission was the first real attempt to centralize control over the entire mafia, creating a framework where decisions could be made collectively and disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than violence. This was a direct reflection of Luciano's business mindset. He saw that constant infighting and rivalry among the families were not only wasteful but dangerous. By creating the commission, Luciano was able to institutionalize the power of the mafia and ensure that its leadership remained unified and strong. But the commission wasn't just a way to ensure peace among the families. It also allowed Luciano to establish his dominance as the de facto boss of the mafia. By having the authority to settle disputes and make decisions that affected the entire criminal network, Luciano positioned himself as the central figure in the mafia. His role was not just that of a powerful gangster. He became the ultimate arbiter of criminal affairs in the United States, with the ability to shape policy, resolve conflicts, and exert influence on a massive scale. His reign over the mafia was not just built on fear and violence. It was built on his ability to control and manage the day-to-day operations of a multifaceted empire. Through the creation of this organized structure, Luciano demonstrated his uncanny ability to think long-term. The mafia, once a collection of independent gangs, had now become a unified and highly efficient organization. But Luciano was not just interested in consolidating power within the confines of his own empire. He had a vision for the mafia that extended beyond New York. He understood that the future of organized crime lay in globalization. To truly dominate the world of crime, Luciano needed to build a network that spanned across the United States and even extended to other parts of the world. His dealings with international criminals, smuggling operations, and drug trafficking networks were part of a larger strategy to create a truly global criminal enterprise. The most notable international aspect of Luciano's business operations was his connection to the Italian mafia in Sicily. While Luciano had established himself as the undisputed boss of the American mafia, he knew that control over international crime syndicates was key to long-term success. Through his connections to the Sicilian mafia, Luciano was able to establish a profitable and secure relationship with criminals in Italy. This relationship not only provided him with a steady supply of goods to smuggle into the U.S., but it also allowed him to expand his reach globally, making him a player on the world stage of organized crime. At the core of Luciano's success was his understanding of the importance of maintaining a balance between criminal and legitimate business interests. He understood that in order to protect his empire, he had to maintain a certain level of distance between his criminal enterprises and his public persona. He built relationships with politicians, law enforcement officials, and business owners, ensuring that his operations remained hidden in plain sight. He understood that the key to success in organized crime was not just about avoiding law enforcement, it was about making sure the law enforcement never even knew where to look. Luciano's efforts to turn the mafia into a legitimate business extended beyond his criminal enterprises. He also made sure to invest in legal businesses that could provide a cover for his illegal operations. He became involved in legitimate industries such as the trucking industry, which allowed him to launder money and maintain a facade of respectability. This dual approach, combining legitimate business ventures with criminal activities, helped him solidify his position as the preeminent figure in organized crime. However, despite Luciano's business-minded approach, his operations were still rooted in the traditional aspects of mafia life: loyalty, intimidation, and violence. While he focused on creating a stable, profitable empire, he never lost sight of the fact that the threat of force was an essential part of maintaining control. His ability to balance the sophisticated, organized structure of his criminal empire with the raw, violent power that had originally defined the mafia was one of the keys to his success. It was this unique combination of business acumen and ruthless aggression that set Luciano apart from his predecessors and made him a lasting figure in the history of organized crime. Through his ability to think beyond the immediate gains of individual criminal acts, Luciano revolutionized the mafia, transforming it from a fragmented collection of street gangs into a powerful, global criminal organization. His innovations in business management, his ability to form strategic alliances, and his use of the commission to centralize control allowed him to build an empire that extended far beyond the streets of New York. In many ways, Luciano's transformation of the mafia into a well-organized, profitable business marked a new chapter in the history of organized crime, one that would leave a lasting legacy in the criminal underworld. His vision and ability to balance the worlds of legitimate business and crime would become the blueprint for future mafia bosses and a hallmark of his reign. As Luciano's influence over the mafia expanded, so too did the complexity of his relationships with those around him. The criminal world he inhabited was a tangled web of alliances, rivalries, and constant power struggles, where loyalty was as valuable as it was fragile. and betrayal could emerge from the most unexpected places. One of the most striking aspects of Luciano's journey was his ability to navigate this labyrinth of alliances and enemies, balancing delicate power dynamics while ensuring that his own position remained secure. The world Luciano entered was a dangerous one, but it was also one where the ability to manage both allies and adversaries with finesse was just as important as controlling territory or managing criminal enterprises. In a world where loyalty could be bought and loyalty could be broken in an instant, the ability to maintain these complex relationships was not just a necessity, it was an art form. Luciano was not a man who forged relationships based purely on trust or affection. Rather, he saw them through a pragmatic lens as tools that could either benefit or hinder his empire. The alliances he formed were often dictated by mutual interests rather than personal affection, and he was always aware of the precariousness of these ties. For every ally that helped to further his ambitions, there were rivals who were waiting for an opportunity to undermine him. Luciano understood that in the criminal underworld, the line between friend and foe was often blurred, and betrayal was always lurking in the shadows. However, this understanding didn't prevent him from building relationships. It simply made him more strategic about how he did so. In the early stages of his rise to power, Luciano carefully chose his associates based on their abilities, influence, and potential value to his organization. He knew that aligning himself with the right people would be crucial to his success, but he also understood that these alliances were fragile. People like Frank Costello, a smooth-talking mobster with a keen sense of politics, became valuable partners. Costello's political connections were instrumental in helping Luciano navigate the complex world of law enforcement and politics. Together, they built a powerful network that allowed Luciano to expand his operations, particularly in labor racketeering and the illegal alcohol trade. Their partnership was built on a mutual understanding of the benefits of cooperation, and each recognized the other's strengths. Costello's ability to manage relationships with politicians and law enforcement made him an invaluable asset, while Luciano's sharp business mind and ruthless efficiency in criminal operations made him the perfect complement to Costello's skills. However, even in alliances that seemed solid, betrayal was always a possibility. Luciano's relationship with his mentor, the powerful boss of the Genovese family, was not immune to tension. While Luciano had learned much from his older counterparts, he was not content to remain in the background, taking orders from others. His ambition, which had driven him to reshape the mafia into a business-like empire, meant that he was constantly seeking ways to increase his own power. In many ways, his drive to transform the mafia was fueled by his realization that the old guard, with their reliance on violence and traditional mafia methods, could not sustain the organization in the long term. He knew that to truly build a lasting empire, he needed to consolidate power and create a system that was more efficient and profitable. And in doing so, he would eventually have to take down those who stood in his way. The first true test of Luciano's ability to manage both allies and enemies came when he orchestrated the removal of the boss of the Castellamarese clan, Salvatore Maranzano. The conflict between the Castellamarese and the Sicilian faction was a fierce and bloody power struggle that had been simmering for years. Luciano saw Maranzano as an obstacle to his plans for the future of the mafia. Maranzano represented the old ways, the traditional, violent, and chaotic methods that Luciano sought to replace with his more strategic, organized approach. The Castellamarese War was a pivotal moment in Luciano's rise, a moment where he demonstrated not just his ruthlessness but his ability to strategically navigate power dynamics. By aligning himself with the powerful families that opposed Maranzano, Luciano was able to orchestrate Maranzano's murder, eliminating his main rival and solidifying his own position at the top of the mafia. While the assassination of Maranzano marked a victory for Luciano, it also exposed the brutal reality of life in the mafia. Loyalty and betrayal were often interchangeable, and those who helped him secure power could just as easily turn on him if the opportunity presented itself. The very same men who had helped Luciano overthrow Maranzano were, in some cases, the ones who would eventually betray him. This constant ebb and flow of loyalty and treachery was a defining feature of the mafia world, and Luciano was no stranger to its dangers. His ability to survive these betrayals was not just a matter of brute force, it was about being constantly aware of the shifting power dynamics around him. Luciano's success was also tied to his understanding of human nature, particularly when it came to the motivations and vulnerabilities of those around him. He knew that fear, while an effective tool in maintaining control, could only take him so far. To keep his empire intact, he needed to forge genuine relationships, even if those relationships were based on self-interest rather than affection. Luciano was a master at reading people, and he knew how to leverage their weaknesses and desires to his advantage. Whether it was providing protection, offering opportunities for wealth, or simply creating a sense of belonging within his organization, Luciano understood that loyalty could be nurtured in many different ways. However, loyalty, even when cultivated through careful manipulation, could still be tested when personal interests or ambitions came into conflict with the larger goals of the organization. Rivalries within the mafia were not just between families, they were often deeply personal. For men like Luciano, whose ambition and vision for the future of the mafia were unmatched, there were always those who sought to challenge his authority. These rivals, like the ambitious and ruthless Vito Genovese, sought to unseat Luciano and take control of the operations that he had built. Genovese, in particular, was a figure who embodied the darker, more violent side of the mafia, and his desire for power would eventually lead to a bitter rivalry between the two men. Despite the animosity between them, Luciano and Genovese had one thing in common: an unyielding drive for power. But where Luciano was pragmatic, calculating, and willing to form strategic alliances, Genovese was more impulsive, relying on violence and intimidation to achieve his goals. In many ways, this difference in approach was what allowed Luciano to maintain control for as long as he did. He was able to recognize that power in the mafia was not just about violence, it was about managing relationships, building alliances, and knowing when to assert authority and when to step back. Luciano's ability to maintain his position at the top of the mafia was due, in large part, to his keen understanding of the psychology of loyalty and betrayal, and his ability to leverage these dynamics in his favor. Even as Luciano expanded his empire and built relationships with powerful figures within the mafia and beyond, he was acutely aware of the constant threat of betrayal. His reign at the top of the mafia would ultimately be tested by his enemies, both within his own organization and outside it. Luciano understood that in the world of organized crime, no one could remain untouchable forever. The key to survival was not only maintaining a strong network of allies but also ensuring that he had the ability to adapt, to evolve, and to stay one step ahead of those who would try to bring him down. Luciano's complex web of alliances, rivalries, and betrayals was not just a reflection of the mafia world. It was a microcosm of the power struggles and dynamics that defined human nature itself. Loyalty was not a fixed concept, and the shifting allegiances of those around him were a constant reminder that in the end, everyone had their own agenda. For Luciano, navigating this treacherous world was an ongoing challenge, one that would require not only cunning and ruthlessness but also an understanding of the deeper currents that drove the men around him. The fact that he was able to maintain his position at the top of the mafia for as long as he did was a testament to his unmatched ability to balance the ever-shifting tides of loyalty, fear, and ambition. In the shadowy underworld of organized crime, power was not just a question of territorial control or wealth, it was also a matter of survival. For Lucky Luciano, survival was not just about enduring the constant threats from rival gangsters or law enforcement, but also about navigating the labyrinthine world of mafia politics, where every action had the potential to tip the delicate balance of power. While Luciano's strategic genius and innovative approach to organizing the mafia had brought him unprecedented success, it also made him a prime target for both external and internal threats. As his influence grew, so did the dangers that came with it. The hidden war that raged beneath the surface of his carefully constructed empire was just as significant as the public one he waged to build his criminal empire. The mafia, by its very nature, was a volatile entity. The rise of a single figure like Luciano often led to a cascade of rivalries and jealousies within the ranks. The same men who once stood by him, helped him climb to power, and forged alliances with him were now the same ones who might seek to challenge him for control. This dynamic was not limited to the streets of New York. It played out in cities across the country and even beyond American borders. Within the mafia, Luciano was constantly walking a fine line, balancing loyalty and betrayal, keeping allies close while never fully trusting anyone. In this world, power was not simply earned, it was constantly defended, constantly tested. The hidden war that surrounded Luciano during his rise was defined by shifting alliances, backroom deals, and betrayals. In the early years of his dominance, he had successfully built a coalition of families and factions that shared in the spoils of the criminal enterprises he had organized. But as his power grew, so did the animosities of others. Rival factions, particularly those aligned with his former mentor, the Castellamarese clan, began to see Luciano as a threat to their own ambitions. The tension between Luciano and other mafia figures, most notably the ambitious Vito Genovese, was a quiet but ever-present conflict that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode into open warfare. This hidden war was not only fought through the usual methods of violence and intimidation, but also through more subtle forms of psychological warfare. Luciano's rivals knew that they couldn't easily challenge him head-on. They needed to undermine his power in more insidious ways. There were whispers, rumors, and veiled threats aimed at sowing distrust within Luciano's organization. Rival gangsters sought to exploit his relationships with his key allies, trying to drive wedges between Luciano and those closest to him. Genovese, for example, was constantly looking for opportunities to weaken Luciano's hold on the power structure, hoping to eventually take control for himself. The tension between the two men was palpable, with Genovese trying to maneuver himself into positions of influence while simultaneously working to discredit Luciano's leadership. At the same time, Luciano's own actions were not without their risks. His method of consolidating power by creating alliances with rival families was a double-edged sword. While these alliances gave him a strong network of support, they also made him vulnerable to betrayal. The same people who helped Luciano overthrow his enemies could easily turn against him if they believed it was in their own interest. This ever-present danger was one of the key elements of the hidden war that defined Luciano's reign. Every decision, every alliance, and every betrayal had to be carefully calculated to ensure that his empire would not crumble under the weight of rival factions and discontented allies. Luciano's ability to maintain control of his empire during this period was a testament to his resilience and strategic brilliance. He was not only fighting a war with external enemies but also with his own subordinates. It was during these turbulent years that Luciano's leadership style truly came into focus. He understood that fear and violence alone were not enough to keep his organization united. Instead, he used a combination of loyalty, respect, and pragmatism to maintain control. Luciano's ability to command loyalty through fear, but also through the promise of mutual benefit, helped him weather the storm of rivalry and internal power struggles. Yet, Luciano was not immune to the pressures of the hidden war. The constant threat of betrayal, whether from old allies or new enemies, weighed heavily on him. Despite his best efforts to maintain unity within his ranks, the reality of the mafia world was that betrayal was often an inevitability. Luciano knew that in the mafia loyalty was as fragile as it was valuable. He understood that the very loyalty he worked so hard to cultivate in his men could easily be turned against him if the circumstances were right. This recognition did not make Luciano paranoid, but it did make him highly attuned to the ever-changing landscape of loyalty and betrayal in the world of organized crime. The hidden war was not just a matter of fighting for control of territory or influence, it was also about controlling the narrative of power. In the criminal world, perception was everything. Luciano was a master of managing the image of power, carefully crafting a public persona that exuded strength and invincibility while quietly ensuring that his internal networks remained intact. He understood that the perception of weakness could be just as dangerous as actual weakness. Even as he faced challenges from within his own ranks, Luciano knew that maintaining an air of control was essential to keeping his empire stable. The hidden war, then, was not just about surviving attacks from enemies, it was about ensuring that his position remained unassailable in the eyes of both allies and adversaries. The tension reached its breaking point in the early 1930s when Luciano was arrested on charges of forced prostitution and sent to trial. The timing of his arrest, combined with the ongoing power struggles within the mafia, placed Luciano's empire in a vulnerable position. His absence from the streets of New York gave his rivals a golden opportunity to challenge his dominance. The hidden war between Luciano and his enemies spilled out into the open as various factions vied for control in his absence. The moment of greatest danger for Luciano came when he was convicted and sentenced to prison time. The possibility that he might lose control of his empire while incarcerated was a real threat, one that required careful planning and quick thinking. Even from within the confines of his prison cell, Luciano was able to continue his influence over the mafia. His strategic foresight, along with the loyalty he had cultivated in his key lieutenants, allowed him to maintain control over his operations. He worked from behind the scenes, using intermediaries to carry out his orders and keep the network of families unified. The power of his presence, even from prison, was a testament to the strength of his leadership and the trust he had built within his organization. But this period also exposed the limits of Luciano's control. While he had managed to consolidate power, he was still vulnerable to the whims of the system, both legal and criminal. Luciano's period of imprisonment marked a turning point in the hidden war. It was not just a matter of maintaining power but also of ensuring the survival of the structure he had built. Rival factions within the mafia began to test the boundaries of Luciano's influence, seeing an opportunity to expand their own territories. The hidden war was now playing out in a more public and aggressive manner, with Luciano's enemies emboldened by his absence. But even in prison, Luciano's influence remained formidable. He had not only built an empire based on crime but also an empire based on loyalty, respect, and the perception of invincibility. Despite the external and internal battles that threatened his reign, Luciano's leadership remained a constant. The hidden war that surrounded him was one that tested his resilience, his cunning, and his ability to adapt. Every challenge, every betrayal, and every power struggle was a part of the larger narrative that defined his legacy. In the world of organized crime, survival was never guaranteed, but Luciano's ability to weather the hidden war and maintain his hold on power made him one of the most iconic figures in the history of the mafia. The story of Lucky Luciano's rise and eventual downfall is a testament to the complexities of power, betrayal, and the delicate balance between personal ambition and survival. Luciano's life, steeped in crime and ruthlessness, reached a critical juncture when the law finally caught up with him. His fall was not a sudden or unexpected event. Rather, it was the culmination of years of carefully calculated risks, power struggles, and shifting alliances. The moment Luciano's empire began to crumble was not merely the consequence of law enforcement closing in on his illegal activities, it was also a product of his own internal battles, the betrayals of trusted allies, and the volatile nature of the world he had so expertly crafted. The first crack in Luciano's armor came when he was arrested in 1936 on charges of running a massive prostitution racket. The arrest, which occurred at the peak of his power, was a blow not just to Luciano's personal empire, but to the very foundation of the mafia's new business-like operations. For years, Luciano had meticulously cultivated a network of allies, turning the fragmented and chaotic world of organized crime into a cohesive, well-oiled machine. His alliances with key figures like Frank Costello, his creation of the Mafia Commission, and his mastery of both the criminal underworld and the legal system allowed him to thrive in ways that no other mafia boss had done before. But the law, as much a part of the system he had helped build as any criminal operation, had finally caught up with him. The arrest was more than just a personal blow to Luciano, it was a moment that exposed the vulnerability of his entire operation. The government, fueled by growing public discontent with the mafia's hold on the nation, was increasingly determined to take down its most powerful figures. Luciano, however, had never been a man to sit idly by when faced with adversity. He was a master strategist, someone who always seemed to be a step ahead of his enemies, but even his vast network of connections and power could not shield him from the relentless pressure of the law. As the trial date approached, Luciano's fate seemed to be hanging in the balance, and for the first time he was faced with a challenge that he could not immediately outmaneuver. Despite his best efforts to defend himself, Luciano was convicted of compulsory prostitution, a crime that was a direct threat to the stability and structure he had worked so hard to build. The conviction came with a heavy sentence, one that would strip him of his position at the helm of the mafia and send him to the notorious Sing Sing prison. The reality of his situation slowly set in. Luciano was no longer a free man, and his carefully crafted empire was now at risk of disintegration. His enemies within the mafia, those who had long coveted his position, saw this as their moment to strike. His rivals, such as Vito Genovese, began to make their moves, sensing that the power vacuum left by Luciano's absence was one they could fill. With Luciano in prison, the delicate alliances he had so carefully constructed were beginning to unravel. But Luciano was not a man who could simply fade into the background. Even from within the confines of Sing Sing, he remained a dominant force in the mafia world. His network of loyalists, many of whom owed their power and success to Luciano himself, continued to operate on his behalf. Frank Costello, one of his most trusted allies, stepped into a leadership role, managing day-to-day operations and ensuring that Luciano's empire remained intact. The public's perception of Luciano, even from prison, was that of a powerful figure, an image he worked hard to maintain. Through his contacts, Luciano continued to exert influence, making deals and giving orders that shaped the future of the mafia even from behind bars. Despite this, Luciano's time in prison was not without its challenges. His rivals, sensing an opportunity to gain ground while he was incarcerated, began to test the strength of his empire. The mafia's power structure, which had been carefully organized through the creation of the commission and the balance of power it established among the families, began to show signs of stress. As tensions grew within the underworld, Luciano's ability to control the situation from a distance was put to the test. This period of uncertainty highlighted the inherent instability of the mafia, which, despite Luciano's efforts to institutionalize and professionalize its operations, remained fundamentally rooted in violence and shifting loyalties. The constant threats from his enemies, both within the mafia and from outside forces, made Luciano's position precarious. His relationship with key figures like Genovese and others in the commission was increasingly strained, with factions vying for control. Yet, Luciano's influence remained undeniable. Even though he was physically behind bars, his reputation and power were enough to keep potential challengers at bay. However, his enemies did not relent. They knew that the only way to truly dethrone Luciano was to remove him from the equation permanently. A plan was hatched to have him permanently silenced. Though it never came to fruition, it was a reminder of just how dangerous the world Luciano had created could be.
During this period of heightened tension, the government also intensified its efforts to weaken Luciano's empire. The FBI, armed with increasing amounts of evidence of Luciano's criminal activities, sought to break the hold the mafia had over the country's major industries. The federal government's growing war on organized crime posed a serious threat to Luciano's operations. His network of politicians, law enforcement officials, and other allies that had protected him for so long was beginning to fracture under the weight of the government's pressure. Despite the efforts of Luciano's allies, the government's crackdown on corruption and organized crime was relentless, and a looming threat of federal intervention was impossible to ignore. Luciano's story took another dramatic turn when, in the early 1940s, his status as a prisoner was used as a political bargaining chip. The government, recognizing the value of Luciano's connections and influence, offered him a deal. In exchange for his cooperation and assistance in the war effort during World War II, he would be granted a reduced sentence and, eventually, deportation. The deal was both a practical and a strategic one. The U.S. government had come to realize that Luciano's influence over the mafia could be useful in the context of the war. The mafia's control over the docks and shipping routes, which were essential for the transportation of goods during wartime, made Luciano an invaluable ally in the fight against the Axis powers. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, agreed to the terms of the deal. In exchange for his release and the promise of a life outside prison, he would work with the government to assist in securing the safety of New York's ports and shipping routes. The arrangement was beneficial to both sides. Luciano would regain his freedom, and the government would gain a powerful ally in its efforts to combat enemy threats to American shipping. It was a remarkable turn of events for Luciano, who had once been the embodiment of organized crime in the U.S., now working alongside the very institutions that had sought to imprison him. Luciano's release was both a triumph and a poignant reminder of how fragile his empire had become. While the terms of his release were generous by the standards of the time, they also marked the end of an era. Luciano's influence within the mafia was diminished as the underworld shifted in response to his absence. New leaders emerged, and Luciano's role within the organization was no longer as central as it had once been. The reality of his situation was clear. While he had survived the legal system, his reign over the mafia had passed. The latter years of Luciano's life were spent in exile in Italy, far from the empire he had built and the world he had dominated. He continued to exert influence over the mafia, but from a distance. His power was no longer what it once was, and his life in exile became one of reflection and adaptation. Despite his fall from power, Luciano's legacy remained a powerful force in the world of organized crime. He had revolutionized the mafia, turning it into a more organized and sophisticated business operation. His legacy as the man who modernized the mafia and created the commission would endure long after his physical departure from the U.S. Luciano's downfall was inevitable, but it was also a reflection of the cyclical nature of power. His rise, his empire building, and his ultimate fall were all part of the same story. The story of a man who shaped the course of organized crime in America and left an indelible mark on its history. The forces that brought about his downfall were the same ones he had once used to consolidate his power: betrayal, ambition, and the fragility of loyalty. In the end, Luciano's story was a reminder of the transient nature of power in the world of organized crime, where even the most seemingly invincible figures are ultimately vulnerable to the shifting tides of loyalty, ambition, and fate. The trial of Lucky Luciano was a defining moment in the history of organized crime, a moment that encapsulated the intricate dance between power, influence, and the law. While Luciano had always been a figure who operated in the shadows, carefully crafting his empire with cunning and calculated precision, the courtroom battle would thrust him into the public eye, forcing him to confront the very forces he had long evaded. The media frenzy that surrounded the trial, the courtroom drama, and the public's growing awareness of the mafia's hold over American society all contributed to the sense that Luciano was no longer a mere criminal kingpin. He was now a symbol of the rise of organized crime, of the complexities of loyalty and betrayal, and of the vulnerability that even the most powerful figures can face when their world begins to unravel. The charges against Luciano were both wide-ranging and deeply serious, stemming from his involvement in running a massive prostitution racket. These were not the petty crimes that many gangsters have been arrested for in the past. These are the kinds of charges that threatened to tear down the empire he had worked so hard to build. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of testimonies from informants, surveillance, and the sheer scale of the operation Luciano had orchestrated. While Luciano had long maintained that his criminal activities were merely business, the scale and brutality of his enterprise, particularly the way in which he controlled and manipulated women through his prostitution ring, were undeniable. This was not just the work of a simple thug. It was the work of a mastermind who had transformed organized crime into a multifaceted, global enterprise.